friends, it's wonderful to be together again. We are dealing with the fourth round in 2 years of elections in Israel. And the question is, of course, why? And the question is, of course, where are we going? Does it going to take us anywhere different than we were after the first, the second, and the third election round? Well, the truth of the matter is, no one quite knows. The different political spokespeople speak as if they know. If you listen to Prime Minister Netanyahu, he is going to be getting his 61 majority plus. Why? Because that's what has to be. More than this is what Israel needs and this is what has to happen, we have not heard yet. Similarly, the leading opposition individuals who are seeing themselves and the parties that they lead as adequate replacement and necessary replacement for Prime Minister Netanyahu basically say the same. They both convey a sense of confidence that they are going to be putting together the next government, but the truth of the matter is no one quite knows. And no one quite knows because if you look at these recent projected results of the elections, what you will see is an impossible situation. And this is more or less the same outcome that we see in most election polls that are taking place for some time now. Namely, if you look at all the parties that are committed to support Benjamin Netanyahu, the Bibi bloc, they come out to 48. Sometimes it's 47, sometimes it's 49, etc. But of course, 48 is far from 61. Well, there is one contender to replace Netanyahu, and that is Yamina, led by Naftali Bennett, the mostly modern Zionist Orthodox party. As I will explain later, Yamina initially okayed participating in our webinar and then just didn't come through. Ayelet Shaked, one of the leaders of Yamina, was supposed to speak at a panel a couple of days ago that was organized by our friends in the conservative Masorti movement and the Israel Chofshit, the secular group, a very interesting panel on the upcoming elections, but she stood them up too. Why is Yamina not interested in speaking to audiences that are interested in religious pluralism? Well, we'll say something more about that later. But the point is, 48 for the devout supporters of Bibi, namely the ultra-Orthodox parties and the party that now calls itself Hatzionut Hadatit, the religious Zionism party, headed by Bezalel Smotrich, who used to be together with Naftali Bennett. He is now on his own, and he has chosen as his partner Ben Gvir, a former Kahanist. And of course, there are many interesting questions that one may ask about that party, but that party is committed to support Netanyahu. So altogether, 48. Well, even with Yamina and its projected 12 seats, they come to 60. What a frustration. And a similar frustration to the one that he faced, more or less, in the first round, the second round, and the third round. He got around it in the third round by breaking apart Kahol Lavan, blue and white, and basically causing some of Kahol Lavan to defect, and led by Benny Gantz, join him to get the necessary majority. Of course, he is saying he'll never repeat that experience. Gantz is saying we'll never both repeat that experience and we'll never support Netanyahu again. But the bottom line is most projections, most polls do not show that Bibi can muster the necessary minimum of 61 votes. Well, the same holds true for the anti-Bibi bloc. Namely, if Bibi can, and supposedly Yamina, in spite of its talk about replacing Bibi, they're also saying at the same time that they'll never give their hand to having Israel face a fifth round of elections. That this is inconceivable. Well, what is inconceivable to Naftali Bennett is quite conceivable to many observers who fear that this is what we are going to see, namely this is where we are heading, that there won't be a decisive result in these elections, and therefore Israel will slip further into having to hold a fifth round. But on the way to a fifth round, and in an attempt to prevent holding a fifth round, Yamina and Naftali Bennett are assumed to agree, in spite of their talk about replacing Netanyahu, assumed to agree to join Netanyahu with some kind of accommodation, some kind of an arrangement, but join Netanyahu. Well, but 48 and 12 are only 60, and if there are 120 Knesset members altogether, then clearly the other camp, the other bloc, also has 60. Now, some polls show that the anti-Bibi bloc may have 61, may have 62. On the other hand, there was already recently one poll that showed that the Bibi bloc may get 61. As you can see, you need a lot of Tylenol in order to endure the coming days, and especially the days closer to March 23rd, Election Day, and following March 23rd, Election Day. Oh, Alex Kushnir, yes, you are here. Wonderful.
Yes, I am.
So, thank you very much. Alex Kushnir is a Knesset member for Israel Beiteinu, the party led by Avigdor Lieberman.
I think that this country is developed for all the Jews from all over the world in order to integrate together in Israel and to live together. And I'm telling you this because I think that this is the main idea of what Israel Beiteinu thinks about religion and about different doctrines of religion. We think that Israel as a state was developed for all the Jews. Doesn't matter if it's secular Jews, Reform Jews, conservative Jews, Orthodox Jews, ultra-Orthodox Jews, all of them. And another thing that we believe is that in a normal democratic state, every citizen have to be able to choose the way of his life, and no one can dictate it. Means that we are want to fight, and we are fighting for freedom of religion and the freedom from religion. Everyone can choose and can decide how he treats the religion and how he obeys this or that laws, or if he obeys at all. And of course, we are struggling for civil marriage. We're struggling for opening the businesses on Shabbat in the places where it's accepted by the community. And we're struggling for building a new coalition without Haredi parties, because we think that there is no room for cooperation with them, because they look at the cooperation only the way that if we agree on what they want, then there will be a cooperation. Otherwise, there is no cooperation. And Israel Beiteinu has an experience working with Haredi parties. We set together in a couple of coalitions, and in Israel, in the Hebrew, you say "En chacham ki bal nisayon." There is no a smart guy as the one who has an experience. So we have an experience, and we understand that there is no way to cooperate, because the Haredi parties and the Haredi politicians and the Haredi leaders making creepy invention on the Israeli state, on the Israeli institutions, on the religious institution in Israel. And of course, there is a point when we said enough. And now we need to fight to be able to keep our country democracy, the democratic country, and to give all the people, all the citizens, the same rights and the same duties.
Avigdor Lieberman has made it clear in recent interviews that there is no way that he would join a coalition that the ultra-Orthodox parties are part of. Do you feel that this is indeed a red line that under no circumstances will Yisrael Beitenu cross after the elections?
I can tell you the one thing. I was the member of negotiation team 3 times, in the first election, second election, and third election. And I can tell all of you that we were, suggested to receive any position that we just imagine. If Avigdor Lieberman could be a prime minister on rotation, and just think that you can only imagine. The only thing that we didn't receive is what we believe and what believe the people who vote for us. That's why there is no way that the Israel Beitenu party will be a part of coalition with Haredi parties, and also not with Netanyahu. And I think that we are the only party who had this option in 3 previous rounds, and we proved that we kept our word.
Now, the sort of connected issue to the specific questions on religion and state is, what is your position on the extent to which Israel and the government should take into consideration the views and positions of diaspora Jewry on issues that concern it or impact on it?
I hope that I understand your question. I will answer, and then you will tell me if I understood it. We need to understand that we are one nation, and the diaspora, especially the biggest diaspora in the United States, of course, has an influence on what's going on in Israel. And of course, the Israeli government has to take into consideration the opinion of this diaspora, and not only this diaspora, but other diasporas also. The problem is that the state is captured by Haredi parties, and they dictate the agenda regarding the relationships with the diaspora, especially with the Reform diaspora. And this is something that we cannot agree on, because the Kotel is for every Jew. Doesn't matter what is the color of kippah that he wears, or if he wears the kippah at all, or if it's the woman or a man. It doesn't matter. So of course we fight together in order to make these things clear, and in order to change the situation today.
Now, to the audience, to our participants, I'm saying that there is probably no party at this time and for the last year or so whose positions on issues of religion and state are as crystal clear as Yisrael Beitenu. But one area I'm particularly interested in how you view it, and that is the issue of conversion. Because we just went through a landmark Supreme Court ruling regarding the entitlement of Reform and conservative converts. And by extension, I assume that the same would apply to renewal and to reconstructionists. But non-Orthodox converts converted in Israel would be entitled to the benefits and the recognition under the law of return. But there is an attempt to pass a law that was recommended by a former Minister of Justice and the son of a former chief rabbi, whose name is Moshe Nissim. And Avigdor Lieberman was heard a number of times expressing support for that bill, which in essence entrenches the authority of the Orthodox rabbinate over conversions in Israel, and states that all conversions would be done in Israel, would be recognized only if they are done through that Orthodox framework. Do you really support a position that will further entrench the monopoly of the Orthodox rabbinate?
I need to tell you the previous story in order to understand our position. In Knesset 20, we were in the coalition with the religious parties. And there are big fights between Lieberman and Litzman regarding the issue of Giyur. And then, in order to come to some conclusion, there was an option that the committee of Nissim will conclude or will decide or will advise to the government the option of how to make a Giyur in order to solve the coalition conflict. And then Lieberman said that, okay, if this is the deal, I'm ready to accept it. But after the Moshe Nissim has written the conclusions, Litzman was the one who said, no, I cannot accept this. So it means that it just proves whatever we said. We said that they don't accept any compromise of anything. That's why today our position is very clear. We are not ready to receive any compromise from that side. It means that each and every Giyur should be legal in Israel. And what the decision of the Supreme Court is acceptable for us. And of course, we appreciate this. And maybe the last sentence I want to say. I want to say that this is the time to understand that the government needs to leave us alone. I mean that if the citizen obeys the law and if the citizen fulfills his duties, he is eligible to receive all the rights, and the state is not in a position to dictate how we need to marry and where we need to work and where we need to drive and when we need to drive and when should we open or close our business. This is the prerogative of the individual and not of the country. So we are working very hard to try to change the reality, because the Haredi parties and their supporters are trying to drive some reality which doesn't really exist. Because I want to remind to every one of you that this country was established by secular Zionism, Zionist activists who dreamed about free Jewish state. Today, we are going to the wrong direction. And this is the time to change it. This is the time to fight for freedom to all of us, to all Jews together, including Haredi Jews, but they need to be with equal rights and with equal duties. That's all.
Thank you. Shalom, shalom.
Shalom, shalom.
And Elazar, I see that you are there. Can you say a word?
Of course.
Okay.
Happy to be with you.
Very good. Well, Elazar Stern he was a general in the army, was the head education officer, but his last role as general, as Aluf, was head of Koach Adam. I don't know, is the proper translation for that human resources?
Yeah.
Elazar, yeah.
The personnel, human resources. Yeah.
And I think it would be of interest to the group here that one thing that Elazar told me, and he recounts in his biographical book, is that there was a very well-known Orthodox philanthropist who contributed Torah scrolls to be placed in communities in Israel to commemorate fallen soldiers. And one of those soldiers was the son of the famous author David Grossman. But the Grossman family were members of Mevaseret Zion Reform Congregation. And the son that has died in action was a bar mitzvah at that congregation. So it was important to the family to place that Torah scroll at the Reform Congregation in Mevaseret. And there was also the issue of the rabbi of that congregation, Rabbi Maya Leibovich, retired from the congregation at this point, to speak at his military funeral. And both issues reached Elazar Stern as head of human resources. And as you can see, well, you may not see, but his kippah is a permanent fixture as a growth of the Zionist Orthodox education system, Bnei Akiva, etc., and that's his choice in life, in personal life. But he spoke and told me that both to this Orthodox donor, and when he was asked whether Rabbi Meyer Leibovitz should be allowed to speak at the funeral, his response was a very strong affirmative response. So Elazar is representative of a new breed of modern Orthodox activists who certainly observes all that he can observe, but has a tolerant view and an open view as to what others should be able to pursue. So Elazar, Yesh Atid, and you personally, how do you feel about the major issues of religion and state that impact on diaspora Jewry or impact on Israel, such as Shabbat and civil marriage and who is a Jew and the Kotel and the other major issues that are on the agenda?
First of all, thank you for having me. And when you ask me about maybe the biggest challenge, since we enjoyed the new immigration from former Soviet Union, which is the conversion issue. I can tell you that this in particular is the main reason for me to make realize my black dream to become a politician, you know, which I never, when I was a Major General, I never had a thought to become a politician. You know, unfortunately, in Israel, in the public opinion, being a Major General is in the uppest place, in the most superior place, and being politician is in the lowest place. But the main reason for me to become a politician, if you want to say, is the conversion, which I also initiate, thank God, a huge project in the army, which still exists. And if you want to generalize it or to put it a little bit wider, to extend it, so it's all the issue of relationship between the state and religion. I think that my biggest advantage, if I can say it, that I grew up in the religious Zionist movement. I think that it's given me advantage to understand a little bit deeper than the average understanding of what we can say, how can we live together, religious, non-religious, secular, ultra-Orthodox, Reform, conservative in Israel, but in the deepest meaning of living together. I also accompanied, if you want to say it, the Kotel Compromise, not only because you are the audience now. I think that the dimension, the conservative and the reforms, even though that in the end of the process of Ne'eman committee, it was Orthodox court, the process was in common together, but in the end of the day, so the reform and the conservative accepted it, and the chief rabbinate refused to accept it. The same I can tell you about the Kotel Compromise. No, it's a top secret, not put it outside, please. But the place that you agreed to have the place to pray near the Kotel HaMa'aravi, no one of the ultra-Orthodox Knesset members prayed that ever. So another time, the biggest concession was done by the Reform and the Conservative. And unfortunately, the same. It failed because the chief rabbinate. So, unfortunately, when you are looking not in the relationship between the state and the religion in Israel, even if you can measure it, I'm not sure about the level of Judaism of Israel as a state. Put aside the ultra-Orthodox, but even if you want, put it inside and then measure the level. And for me, the level is, for example, the level of pride being Jewish in Israel. And unfortunately, the current relationship between the state and religion put the average Israeli far away from, the willingness to say, I am proud to be Jewish. And my assignment is to be there. Unlike my Knesset member, my friend Alex Kushnir was here, which I very respect his position and of course respect himself. I think that I came from the point of not only say full freedom. I understand that the only way to exist is being in the same time, Jewish state and democracy. And in order for these two terms to live together, from time to time, the democracy has to pay a price in order to live with Judaism, and from time to time, the Judaism, according to interpretation which everyone can choose, should pay a price in order to live with democracy. And I'm ready to pay it. And I'm saying that we don't have any other option than to pay it. So you can choose the conversion, the enlistment, the Shabbat in Israel, you name it, the Kotel Compromise. We are in Yesh Atid. We consider ourselves like a central party. Central party is not only compromise. Central party in the Rambam vision is the golden path. So being in the golden path, no one can get 100% of his inspiration. We know that we have to make from time to time concession. When I wrote the bill of conversion, it was close to Orthodox deal. But even not one letter was written there without the agreement of the conservative and reform. They were sitting with me in the legislation committee in the Knesset. Every word was in agreement. So at the end of the day, I believe, first of all, that the reform on the conservative has a full right to convert everyone that they want to convert. But if you'd ask me if I think that it should be together, I think that we have to sit together and see, because I'm not sure that even Rabbi Hirsch or Rabbi Regev agree to every conversion which is take place in all United States of America now. So I think that when we are, I think it's very strange position that we give the right to give everyone there the right to give citizenship in Israel with no any other, how can we define it? You know what I mean, because once you are define someone as a Jew, you give him the right to become citizen in Israel. And I'm not afraid, because I know the faces here. I trust them.
Can you in a minute tell us what you consider to be a red line for Yesh Atid on issues of religion and state?
Public transportation, Kotel compromise, conversion, Shabbat, mini markets, you know, in the way that Hyundai established it in Tel Aviv, you know, which is according to, I don't want, you know, to talk too much, according to Meidan Gabizon agreements, you know, about how the Shabbat should be placed. I think that everyone in Israel must have the right to build a family. Doesn't matter if he is Jewish, non-Jewish, if he is a guy, everyone, okay? Unfortunately, according to the current situation, you can marry or have a chuppah under only two conditions, or if two of you Jewish, or if two of you non-Jewish. If one Jewish and one is not Jewish, or the chief rabbin doesn't recognize this as a Jewish, go to Cyprus or Czech Republic, which is unbelievable in democracy. So I think that we don't have the right not to allow everyone to build, every couple, to build the family in the way that they want to build it. And I can say it only from my religious point of view. It's enough, no?
Thank you, Elazar. I think that all of us have had a living example for a new breed of modern Orthodox activists, leaders, high-ranking officers, high-ranking people in government who are presenting and advocating for a vision of Israel as a Jewish democratic state, which is far more pluralistic and far more inclusive than we have been able to see over the recent decades. So thank you, Elazar, and let's move on to the conversion Supreme Court decision and its aftermath. I would like to first respond to questions that you may have, and then I'll make a few observations regarding the case. I already see that Professor Michael Chernik, what Michael Chernik wrote is the Ministry of the Interior and its minister, Aryeh Deri, have added details to the law of return that make it impossible for Abba Yudaya and all emerging communities, quote unquote, to have an acceptable conversion. The issue of emerging communities, to be fair to the Ministry of the Interior, is really not so much Deri's and the Ministry of the Interior creation, but a sort of an extension of the Supreme Court ruling regarding recognized conversions, which uses the term Kihila Mukeret, recognized community. And the question had to arise, what does it mean, recognized community? Which communities are recognized and which are not? And that's how the concept of emerging communities, because it's one thing to deal with BJs or with Temple Emmanuel and other congregations that are represented in this call, that have been in existence for decades, if not for centuries. And it's another altogether when you deal with the Abba Yudaya, where you can put your finger and say, this is the moment this Jewish community emerged. And the question is, what happens in the period that precedes it? What happens in the period that follows it? Now, it's particularly getting complicated because the whole congregation, the whole community is made up of converts, sincere converts, converts who are active in pursuing Jewish life. But it's a congregation that is made of converts, and the legal question that emanates from it, which we, the JPLAN, the Jewish Pluralism Legal Action Network, and Ruach Hidush, are very, firm in our support for the recognition of the Bar Yehuda community and the converts in that community. But this is a complex legal question. Let's go to the Supreme Court ruling. There was one question that I saw that Peter Berger, if I'm not mistaken, asked. Peter, can you ask your question?
The question I asked on this subject was apparently the Supreme Court's decision is very narrow in scope. It applies only to conversions done within the state of Israel. So the question is, does anybody think that that principle is likely at some point to be extended to conversions done by Reform or Orthodox rabbis and congregations outside of Israel? And the second question I had was, the court's decision is very limited, but it's by the court. And is there any likelihood, is it possible and is it likely that the Knesset will overturn that principle and go back to the old rule?
So regarding the first question, I think it's important to explain. This court ruling came as a step in a longer path that started back with, and some of you may remember, Susan Miller in 1986-87, who converted in Colorado under Reform auspices and sought recognition as a Jewess for the purpose of the law of return and being registered as a Jewess in the population registry. The irony then was that there was no question in the mind of the population registry and Ministry of the Interior official. They had no problem giving her Israeli citizenship under the law of return. What they refused to do was to register her as Jewish. And they basically were very generous. They said, you choose whatever ethnic, national identity you want. You say it, we'll write it, just not Jewish. And of course, the Supreme Court case that we brought resulted with two things. A, at that time, we called it the Who is a Jew Action Center. And the next step, it resulted with the creation of the Israel Religious Action Center. But the point is that the battle over who is a Jew had the following stages. First of all, we fought on overseas conversions and the right of those who converted non-Orthodox overseas to be accepted under the law of return and be registered as Jewish. The next step was fighting legally, fighting for the right of individuals who were converted in Israel under the auspices of the Reform and conservative movements. And I know that there is an issue of great delicacy and interest. Please understand, we are fighting for pluralism and for inclusion of all streams in Judaism under the umbrella of Israeli law. But the extent to which renewal and reconstructionist Judaism is organized and active in Israel makes it at this point premature, but definitely a next step to ensure that those who converted reconstructionist or renewal will be able to independently of others be able to gain recognition. But the point is, at that stage, we fought for individuals converted under the auspices of the rabbinic courts of the Reform and conservative movements in Israel to be able to be registered as Jews. Because following the ascent of the Shas-governed, Shas-controlled Ministry of the Interior, they administratively issued instructions that these converts not be registered as Jews. So we succeeded in getting the courts to interpret the definition of who is a Jew in the population registry law, which reads, a Jew is a person born to a Jewish mother or has been converted and is not a member of another religion, to interpret the has been converted as including those who converted under Reform or conservative auspices. The third stage was because the court distinguished between recognition for the purpose of registration in the population registry on the one hand, and being eligible to Israeli citizenship under the law of return on the other hand, both were granted to overseas converts, but not to Israeli converts. So the next battle was whether the law of return and the right of aliyah, the right to Israeli citizenship, would also apply to those converted in Israel. So Robert, it's exactly the opposite. Those who were converted overseas were granted recognition first. Then we moved on to fight for those who were converted in Israel. Now, the ugly aspect of it is that immediately after the issuing of the Supreme Court ruling, then vehement reaction on the part of the ultra-Orthodox community and the chief rabbinate started appearing in the press, and these are in the press and in the political arena, and these are just three examples that will illustrate how ugly, how vehement, how poisonous the reaction has been, and why I feel that this is not just a battle that we conduct in Israel. This is really a battle that should engage world Jewish communities that care for Israel's identity as a Jewish and democratic and inclusive and pluralistic state. So one appeared on this last Thursday on one of Israel's most popular ultra-Orthodox weekly. And what you see is the headline, Lederon Olam, Eternal Damnation. And you can see the COVID-19 virus character. And what he is holding in his hand is the text saying, Hamutatia harefomit, the reform mutation, the reform variant. And of course, he is marching into what depicts, Jerusalem, marching into Israel, and the gate is opened by this judge-looking individual. So Reform Judaism, Reform conversions are basically a poisonous mutation of COVID-19 that are out to destroy Israel and destroy the Jewish people. Similarly, the Shas party campaign now has a number of visuals such as this. The top title in a frame is Yehudim Be'asher Bagatz, Jews with the stamp of approval of the Bagatz. Namely, they aren't Jews, they are Bagatz-sponsored Jews. And the operative text is Sakana, danger, thousands of infiltrators and foreign workers will undergo reform conversions and become Jewish. Namely, they won't become Jewish, but they will be recognized as Jewish. And of course, the campaign appeal is Shas tishmor al medina yehudit. Shas will preserve, will safeguard a Jewish state. So what we are about is mass conversions of infiltrators and foreign workers. And of course, one of the leaders of Shas, Knesset member Moshe Arbel, basically said, publicly said, now it's very clear. All that these foreign workers, Sudanese, asylum seekers will have to do is they'll pay a bribe to a reform rabbi and obtain a conversion certificate that will enable them to settle and thereby endanger the state of Israel. And of course, a very ugly and really despicable reaction was that of the Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox party, United Torah Judaism, that immediately issued a clip that basically presented that the reform movement, on the one hand, is holding bar mitzvah, namely is bar mitzvahing dogs, but they went further to imply that he's converting dogs and this is a Jewish dog, and there were a number of dogs in this clip. There are Jewish dogs because the Supreme Court has made them Jewish. And one of those dogs, they're mocking, saying, you know, he's Jewish because his grandmother was a rabbi. So again, the message that United Torah Judaism, the ultra-Orthodox Ashkenazi party, is conveying: only United Torah Judaism will safeguard your Judaism. Yahadut Torah, United Torah Judaism, Gimel is their sign. So what we need to understand is that even though Robert Berger was right, and the court ruling was very narrow, at the same time, it is symbolically granting recognition to Reform and Conservative. And what they are reacting to is not the specifics of the conversion ruling, but really its symbolism about inclusion and acceptance. Now, you're asking whether the Knesset can overturn it. Of course, the Knesset can overturn it. As a matter of fact, the election series starting in March of 2019 started in part because Shas was demanding a conversion bill that would ensure that the only conversions recognized in Israel are those that are authorized under and approved of by the chief rabbinate. And Netanyahu at that time, in 2019, 2018, understood that this is dynamite. Changing the conversion laws, on the one hand, will be appeasing Shas, on the other hand, will be alienating American Jewry, world Jewry, North American Jewry. And Netanyahu is smart enough to know that this is not stuff that you can touch gingerly. This is explosive. So he tried to avoid it. And that led to, because they demanded that he didn't want to deliver, that resulted to a great degree with the dismantling of the government and the first elections that were held. The court ruling came, as you may know, 15 years after the first petitions were submitted in 2005. 15 years. As one of the justices is saying, this is rare. I mean, the Supreme Court is not quick to render decisions, but 15 years is really something that's very, very exceptional. It's not that exceptional in terms of the concept behind it. The court understands that it is walking in a minefield. It understands, and one of the justices spoke about it explicitly. He said, we appealed to the Knesset again and again and again. Decide what you want to do with it. But they didn't. They wanted, he writes, they wanted the Supreme Court to pull the chestnuts out of the fire. And the irony and the cynicism here is the Knesset and the government didn't want to vote because they were caught between the hammer and the hard place, or the rock and the hard place, or whatever the phrase is, with the ultra-Orthodox parties pressuring them on the one hand, and world Jewry pressuring them on the other. So they wanted the court to make the decision, and were ready to delegitimize the court and assault the court once it made the decision. But the bottom line is that it represents conflicting visions of the majority judges, and not only this one minority judge, but the three Orthodox judges on the court. There were three Orthodox judges in the 9 judges panel, and all 3 of them basically said, if it were up to us, we would embrace an inclusive Orthodox conversion-only approach. Namely, there should be state-sanctioned conversions. They're the ones that should be recognized. And that is in the interest of the Jewish people. that is going to resolve the social conflicts within the Jewish people and within the Jewish community in the state of Israel. But this is our view. The majority in the court has consistently ruled in favor of this recognition, and therefore we bow our heads to these precedents, and we have to endorse it as well and to approve it as well. But they say, what we can't do, the Knesset may be able to do. So yes, the Knesset may overturn it, which will lead to two things. One is, I hope very much that the Jewish leadership throughout the world is going to fight against it. And is going to fight against it as it did in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, and then in the mid-2000s. About every 10 years, there is a Who is a Jew war that explodes. Because as you can see from those ugly caricatures and the ugly reaction and the statements, this is not just about me as a Reform rabbi, this is about all of us as liberal Jews, whether we are Reform, Conservative, and ironically Modern Orthodox. Because the most famous convert in the world today, I guess, Ivanka Trump, she's not the only one that Rabbi Haskell Luxtin converted. And another female convert of his made Aliyah. Young convert, and she wanted to get married. And lo and behold, she had to get the approval of the rabbinic court in Jerusalem, where she resided, and the court said, we don't know of Rabbi Haskell Luxtin, we don't recognize him, and we don't recognize your conversion. She appealed to the Rabbinic Court of Appeal, and the Rabbinic Court of Appeal said, we don't recognize Luxtin's conversions. So we are now in the same boat, so to speak, Modern Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, Renewal, Reconstructionist, which Jewishly make up the majority of the religiously identified Jews in the world. We all share an interest, and that interest is not serve our needs as denominations, but serve the needs of a Israel, which should be a, if not a physical home, a spiritual home for all Jews, which would live up to its own promises in its vision outlined in the Declaration of Independence, that of religious freedom and equality to all.
Ori, I have a question.
Yes, please.
Gilad Kariv, a Reform rabbi, is number 4 on the labor list, which is led by a impressive woman.
Yes.
And today is International Women's Day, so we should recognize that. So a lot of people may go out and vote for Labor who are interested in this issue of religious pluralism. On the other hand, it looks like maybe as a result, Meretz might not make the threshold. Who should we vote for?
Well, first of all, those of you who attended the webinar 2 weeks ago know that both Gilad Kariv and MK Tami Zandberg from Meretz, they spoke. And Gilad, on the one hand, is a great hope and great progress, because it's the first time that a Reform rabbi will serve at the Knesset. There were Reform Jews and Conservative Jews that served in the Knesset, but it's the first time that Reform Jews will serve. And as a matter of fact, again, if you saw the newsletter, you will see the statement that was issued by Chidush and the Jewish Pluralism Legal Action Network and Ruach Chidush, Rabbis and Cantors for Religious Freedom and Equality, in response to yet another, or actually prior, assault on the part of both Shas and United Torah Judaism that said, if he gets into the Knesset, we are not going to sit next to him. And of course, this isn't just a mild threat, because the chair of the Knesset Finance Committee, Rabbi Moshe Gafni, is known to have stepped out consistently from any Knesset discussion in which a Reform or Conservative representative is speaking. And I go back in my mind to when I and my Conservative counterpart, Rabbi Ehud Bandel, decades ago, would speak at the Knesset. He would do that. He would mumble some obscenities and demonstratively step out of the room until we finished talking. But Gilad was open enough to suggest that it may not be that simple, because if Labour finds itself in a coalition where some compromises will have to be made, we need to understand that those compromises will have to be made. So it's not that simple. And of course, you are right, and that does jeopardize Meretz's position now. In most polls, they passed the threshold of 3.25%. In some recent polls, they don't pass the threshold. They come close to it, but under it. And I am certainly not going to be responding to the question, so who should we be voting for? And it is really very difficult to tell at this time who is going to have the upper hand. In most polls, the anti-Bibi camp has the upper hand. It's a narrow margin, but it is still a majority. The problem, of course, of the anti-Bibi camp is that it consists of left, center, and right-wing parties, and I think presented us something that people are not necessarily understanding, namely, support for religious freedom and pluralism is not the domain of the left alone. And that was the premise in creating Chidush, that the issues of settlements and peace process and economic issues, etc., divide left and right. But religious freedom and equality, to a great degree, unites left and right and enjoys a much greater majority than is either shared by the right or by the left alone. And therefore, our approach was, we need to create a framework, an advocacy framework that is focusing solely on religious freedom and equality, so as to be able to bring on board both political left and political right. And this is exactly what we see in our leadership and in those that endorse our message. And with that, I think we'll stop. Thank you all for being with us, and shalom, and good night here from Jerusalem, and enjoy the afternoon wherever you are in the west of Israel. Shalom and להתראות.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.